So our reading, carrying on now in Matthew chapter 2. Now when they, those wise men from the east, had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Said, rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. He sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. Voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Marcus, I think you're on your way out.
There's a big sign from James here.
That's one of those standard Christmas readings, perhaps particularly the first half of Matthew chapter 2. And certainly you'll hear that just about every year you come here at Christmas time. It conjures up those images of Christmas cards, well, a few that still have something religious on them. We even just had one this year with, would you believe, a beehive on it. I think it's a friend of ours who had just retired and taken up beekeeping. But let's stay with the traditional picture, at least for a while. And as I've said quite often, when considering this picture, not just the three guys on a camel each, with all the servants and hangers-on that dignitaries from foreign lands would have with them. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Not to the manger scene either, really, to complete that standard set of figures for your school nativity play, with the infinitely extensible number of angels and shepherds, depending on how big the class is. I imagine we're looking at a minimum of a year later, and Mary and Joseph and Jesus are now resident in a house and going into the house, we read earlier. But the traditions are right about that surprising, disturbing message. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. To someone who wasn't properly Jewish, like Herod, but rather enjoyed having the title King of the Jews, that spelled trouble indeed. Because Jesus will not be a pretender to that throne, he will be far worse. He will be a legitimate claimant. If that's true, Herod has to give way to give place to the rightful ruler of that land, which, knowing Herod, is going to be a messy scene. Think the transfer of power between the two American presidents that was going on a year ago. If that was messy, Herod giving way to Jesus was not going to be anything lighter, was it? So when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Because, of course, if there's unsettled times in the palace, it trickles down. But, thinks Herod, let's get all the background work done here. He's a canny player, you must at least admit that. Is there any local intelligence on the matter? Well, conveniently, he finds that the scriptures have an answer to this. Assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it's written by the prophet. And actually, this is curious, just for starters, isn't it? Stop and think about this one. If you give credit to these ancient writings to reveal God's plan for the world, but then you set yourself against what those plans have revealed, if you oppose the person specified in that prophecy, then this Herod has to be a calculating, not unbeliever, but disbeliever. He believes the prophecy, but he rejects it. No wonder the road ahead is going to be unpleasant. But he hides his snarl behind a genial smile. Perhaps these guys can do some of my work for me. Why spend time ransacking the area if some inadvertent spies can do the work for me? And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. Whatever that star was, they do indeed find their way to that very house. And even if the strange mysteries of some pagan religion are what have guided these people to this miraculous birth, well, they recognize something greater and truer than anything they previously encountered. Going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Finally, here is not merely a religion, a system of rules about how to live, a set of ideas about why things are in this world as they are, or which is about how this world could or should be. But here, a person, God in a body. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We've seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Those three gifts are brought out, finally, treasures of immense value. They opened their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, I've always vaguely rebelled at the way Christmas presents changed as I grew up. When I was a kid, it was toys. Remember this one? The mousetrap game, yeah. When you were kids, you got games. As you grew up, things became more and more practical. You think socks like that are practical? But the gifts of these wise men were very practical indeed. They were effectively very high denomination banknotes, a bit like those traveller's checks you used to get before credit cards took over. Exchangeable in any country for the whatever you needed in that country. So this little baby, this little family, is going to be in serious need of finance in the next few months as they become refugees. We'll come to that in a moment. But with the traditional picture coming to a close, the wise men sneak off back home without informing Herod concerning their whereabouts. Being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, how do you picture that? I think the more traditional idea here is that there was some kind of angel involvement in this dream. We're told, now notice the words I've highlighted there, when an angel appears to Joseph, you have it in the text, behold an angel, that special behold, attention-grabbing word. But we don't get that as regards the wise men. So I'm wondering if these wise men are actually guided in what seems a much more natural way. They dreamed, and sometimes dreams are a way of us turning over in our minds things that we haven't consciously spelled out very precisely. We haven't really thought through, but somehow in our dreams, they jumble and then fall into some kind of shape. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Maybe it is just as simple, but just as much God's guidance as one of those guys waking up in the morning and saying to the others, I had a really odd dream last night about that King Herod. On reflection, I'm not so sure he's someone we can trust. And when one says it, they find they all have some feelings of wariness and uncertainty about Herod. Now you come to mention it, and they decide between them that it would be wiser to slip off quietly back home. So, no big angel in a dream, and behold, maybe this is just the basis of a life of experience, of the intrigues in the palace court for decades, which has given them a finely developed sense of smelling a rat. Folks, do not despise those natural skills that should be developing over the decades. It's called wisdom, or it should be. Why do you think it is that the leadership of a church is supposed to be the responsibility of the elders rather than the youngers? Hopefully they should have learned a few tricks over the years. But now see how Matthew reinforces for us that this Jesus is not just the one born king, but he is the promised king. We'll hear this from time to time in the book Matthew wrote, with Jesus' Jewish ancestry right in front of us, right from the start. Do you remember? Chapter 1, verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He is the heir of all of those promises. And Matthew will remind us as we go through. You see, this lines up with what the Old Testament said there. And those three scenarios from these early couple of years of Jesus' life are presented to us now as fulfillments of those promises and those prophecies. Not just that it was in Bethlehem that he was to be born, although that was prophesied there, but what further transpires around that little town. And there's three that I particularly see in this next section. The first one, when we get run for your life. Whenever I see this phrase now, I'm taken back to when they relaunched Doctor Who. Hello, Rose, I'm the doctor. Run for your life. But no, this is based on reality 2,000 years ago and the experience in that little town of Bethlehem, or the big city up the road, Jerusalem. It must have been a pretty close run thing, actually. I wonder whether Herod was keeping tabs on these wise men. I would have, wouldn't you, if you were sending them there as inadvertent spies? Would you totally trust them? So when they didn't return, when he was expecting them, I suspect he had a very vicious plan B up his sleeve. Just thinking about it now, I wonder whether the wise men decided to slip off under cover of night. Not sure. Being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Perhaps they've discussed this alternative arrangement during the morning. If, as I suggested, they wake up, they discuss their dreams the previous night. By the time they've come to the decision, they can't get off at the crack of dawn and perhaps evade surveillance, get a decent distance away by sundown. Maybe they decide that they will leave under cover of dark as soon as it gets dark. Just a guess on my part. But so after the excitement of the visit has died down, you can imagine Joseph and Mary at the door, Mary holding Jesus in the crook of her arm. They wave as the wise men and their entourage leave. I think that's getting a bit sentimental, but Joseph and Mary decide to put the baby down and get an early night themselves. Only it wasn't a very long sleep. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." So folks, don't expect the plan of God to proceed smoothly. We've seen this pattern before, and Egypt was in view then as well. There was another king, only in Egypt the kings were called pharaohs, remember? And we were told about another baby in peril of his life, who miraculously escapes and goes on to lead his people to freedom. So maybe Matthew is deliberately trying to wave before us the possibility that this Jesus is like a new Moses, really. Never mind that interesting theological stuff for now. It's all very theoretical, maybe. For Joseph and Mary, it is drop everything and run for your life. Joseph, follows the precise commands of the angel. Rise, take the child, flee. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. Those gifts from the wise men will probably pay their expenses on the way. But the first thing is to be on that way. In the night, possibly, I don't know, at a guess, maybe no more than an hour since they were disturbed from sleep when the angel woke Joseph in that way. And the fourth command from the angel, remain. That too. And remained there until the death of Herod. Now Matthew drops this theological comment on us. We might have thought the plans were going seriously wrong, but no. Even with Herod on the rampage, God's plans are not being deflected at all. This fits with the other stuff previously written, in this case, over 1,000 years back. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. See, elements of the storyline of Moses and the nation of Israel definitely line up in many ways, even if not in every way, with what is happening to Jesus now. Egypt was originally, remember your stories back in Genesis, Jacob, Joseph going to Egypt and all of that stuff. Originally, Egypt was the place of safety then as well. Jacob and his family went there to escape famine. It only morphed into that oppressive regime over successive centuries. Moses, as we already mentioned, Moses escapes Pharaoh's murderous decree, kill all the baby boys, just as Jesus escapes Herod's murderous decree to kill all the baby boys. God spoke of the nation of Israel as his son. Right back when Moses was being commissioned to go and speak to Pharaoh, here's part of what God told him to say. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. The whole episode of the Exodus is summed up by the prophet Hosea. That's the quote that Matthew is putting before us now. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. See, the very same words. And yet Israel, that prototype project, if you like, eventually failed. But here I think Matthew is trying to hint to us, here is another son. And this son is not going to fail. This son of Abraham, this son of David, is going to succeed where Israel didn't. He will retrace the steps of Israel, but he will not stop, as we will see as we read through the book. But those steps are not going to be painless. The world around will still oppose the gracious purposes of God. And then they were told, weep for your children. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. That's what you get with absolute power. The ability to wreak atrocities. Democracy might not be a perfect system, and you've only got to listen to the news any day of the week, and you see proof of that. If the greatest abuse of power in this country and the current conservative regime was to have held those admittedly outrageous Christmas parties a year ago. If that's the worst it gets to, we've got off lightly. Look around the world for yourself nowadays. Any place where you get just a communal garden dictator, never mind a Herod, ask yourself if you'd really prefer to live there. Yet even that atrocity of Herod 2,000 years ago had not been overlooked by God. Hundreds of years earlier, there were verses written that fit perfectly with the massacre of the Bethlehem innocents. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Jeremiah's times now, not Moses, but a bit later on. This was when Israel had been a nation for centuries, but had fallen to invasion by the Babylonians. Untold thousands must have perished. And anyone who was anyone of those left alive were being deported hundreds of miles away. It was as if the nation was being dismembered. Rachel? Who's Rachel? I think that has to be a poetic mention of Jacob's wife, Rachel. If Jacob is the one whose name God changed to Israel, essentially the father of the nation that went on to bear his name, then Rachel is the mother of that nation. And who will most especially weep as that nation, her children, is hacked apart before her very eyes? It will be Rachel who will weep for her children. And Ramah, there you might think, what on earth has that to do with it? Ramah is probably the nearest to it's the nearest village or town to the site from where the deportations into Babylon were happening, bearing into captivity all those children. Who knows what dire fate they would suffer in the lands of pagans. Ramah was their place of deportation. But run your eyes further along the history of Israel, and you'll see that God didn't forget his people. 70 years later, the world order changes again, and those exiles can return home. Folks, we can only ever look at our own times, and we have really quite short vision, narrow vision. We see catastrophes in our own times, and we see them out of historic proportion. Whenever there is some national tragedy, you will hear people say, I will never forget them. There's not one day of my life that I will not remember this day and these people. But in time, our memories will fade. Yet God remembered his promise to Abraham and his descendants, and he restored that nation again, even though it took 70 long years, a whole long lifetime for those days. But he promised that he would. And the prophet Isaiah showed people how surely God's not going to forget. Using a human picture, can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Actually, yes. Even these may forget. Yet I will not forget you. Behold, I have. Doesn't this make us think Easter as well as Christmas? I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. How do we know that God will not forget you and me nowadays? If we go and commit some atrocity, behold, I have engraved you on the palm of my hands. So Joseph has taken Mary and Jesus into a foreign land. God has not forgotten them either. He will bring them home in due time. God's plans have still not been wrecked by Herod the king in his regime. Return to your homeland. Herod, that supposedly great king, only merits a few more words in passing in this book. His opposition to God's plans, his attempts to murder this child-born king of the Jews, those plans just crumble away and come to nothing. He just dies. And time now for another dramatic angelic visitation with a behold the angel. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. Another dream and another message, very similar to the original one, the way it starts off, but the very opposite, saying, rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And Joseph, once again, solidly does just what he's told. We don't hear an awful lot about this guy, but goodness, just see how he jumps to it and does all of this Christmas story stuff without batting an eye, it seems. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. I think Matthew must have rather have liked Joseph, though most likely he never met him. But you can hear the respect he owned for this guy in an earlier comment, I think, and her husband Joseph being a just man. But he's a canny one too. Israel in general terms might be a safer place again now, but there's no point in taking silly risks. That's what the government's telling us nowadays about masks and stuff, isn't it? The son of Herod might be something of a chip off the old block. He might still be sensitive about any potential rival to that title, King of the Jews. So whether it's because of another angel visiting or not, I'm not sure, but there's another dream. When he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a city named Nazareth. But the final line of this chapter, I have to admit, is a bit of a puzzle. Matthew is still telling us that God's plan is fully on track. Despite Herod, despite time in Egypt, God's son is precisely where he should be at the precise point in time, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now that, first of all, sounds like another quote from the Old Testament, doesn't it? But look, there's no quote marks there. Okay, that's a more modern convention of the English language. But the way it's phrased, it just look, it doesn't actually ascribe that to a single prophet. It says the prophets, not the prophet, give a name. I confess this doesn't quite sit so very comfortably with me, but it would have been just fine with Jewish readers. The nearest thing we get to this, I think, in English is a pun, play on words, sound alike. Now, I know in English culture, puns usually are greeted by groans. But to the Jewish mind, wordplay, words that sound like something else, conveying elusive meanings, that was mainstream stuff. They loved it. And it comes in their prophecy as well. You think, this is not a way to, we wouldn't do it this way, but they did. And let me give you an example. And you can see the sound alike in this. Amos chapter 8, verse 1 and 2. This is what the Lord God showed me. Behold, a basket of summer fruit. And he said, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a basket of summer fruit. And the Lord said to me, the end has come upon my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. You think, sorry, Peter, you said there's a pun there. Actually, calling that a pun elevates Christmas cracker jokes to high literature. There's no pun there, but there is. Those words are coloured in. They're nearly the same in that line. Summer fruit there in Hebrew sounds almost identical to the word in Hebrew for end, so coloured in green. And there's a translation which I think says a basket of ripe fruit, and then later on says, the time is ripe for my people Israel. And that's the kind of thing we're getting at there. Two words that sound alike, mean something, ring a bell in the sort of like the Hebrew mindset. And Matthew is writing particularly to Jewish readers. So, Nazareth. Get that, the sound of the word Nazareth in your mind. He went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would call a Nazarene. Okay, Nazarene, someone who lives in Nazareth. That's fine. That's your first word. There are two others here in this passage, and they all sound alike. If you know your Jewish background, one shows through into English, the other doesn't. And here's the first one, is that vow of special consecration to God. You can find in the Old Testament. Nazareth, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when either a man or woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, to separate himself to the Lord. That is an allusion to, I think, yes, Jesus was separated to the Lord in some special sense, for some special service. And that pun, if you like, works to the Hebrew mindset. But there is another possibility again. There were prophecies about the royal line of David being cut down like a tree, leaving just a stump in the ground. But a stump could start growing again. One of the Hebrew words that is used for this can be translated branch or shoot or something like that. Here's one of them, again in the book of Isaiah. It's one of those passages which is clearly talking about the Messiah. It uses the word branch in. I'll show you the Hebrew word. I don't often want to show you how Hebrew words sound in English, but in this case it's relevant. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a netzer from his root shall bear fruit. Do you remember back when there was that huge hurricane back in the 1980s? And poor old Michael Fish famously denied that it was about to happen. During, I think it was the second of those, there was 2 years after, there was another huge storm. It brought down a willow tree in the next door garden. They had it cut into something like 2 foot long sections, but not removed. They had these gigantic, they thought they might make nice seats in the garden, but actually the problem was about willow trees. You can have a sort of like a 2 foot stump, cut top and bottom, and you leave it on grass, and it'll shoot. It will sprout, and they did. Not quite like that, but that's the general idea. Cut it down, and it starts growing again, even though you think you've wiped out all the life there. That's a picture of what is happening here with Jesus, I think. Or maybe with Israel as a nation. It has been cut down to the ground, but here is that shoot of life, this branch from the roots growing again. Because God's promise of life is so potent that even being chopped down to the ground, it will grow again. Herod can come and try and root it out. But the Son of God merely relocates temporarily to Egypt. All of those prophecies relate to Egypt as well that we've read, remember? God's plan is on track still. We would maybe argue that something awful like that massacre in Bethlehem is just too terrible for God to factor in, but Scripture insists that's not the case. There is a prophecy that fits perfectly even for that atrocity. See, God's plan is still in place. God's plan is still on track. And when the Son of God ends up in the back of beyond, goodness, Nazareth of all places, yes, you guessed it, there are prophecies that fit in with that too. Even if they are puns which don't work brilliantly for us. God's plan is on track. Which, of course, is precisely what the New Testament says as well. When the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. What's the effect of that on people like us nowadays, even 2,000 years later? Because you are sons, ladies, you count as a son in this way of thinking as well. That means you can inherit too. Sons inherited in those days, daughters, sadly, otherwise. But because you are sons, because you are inheritors, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. If a son, then an heir through God. Because God's plan is still totally on track. And Christmas is when we remember and celebrate that the coming King, around whom focused all of those hopes and fears of all the years, the promised King came. Let's pray, shall we?